Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm not sure you'll be so keen to have had me in your company at the end of it, because I like to say this in relation to where we are. Guernsey is the best place in the world to live. It really is the best place. I don't say that as a dyed-in-the-wool Guernseyman whose family have been here for hundreds of years. I say that as somebody who went off to do his law studies at the end of the 60s. There was a barrister in England and came back in the early 80s. And I've been fortunate enough to travel to 50 different countries in my life, both professionally and with my family, etc., etc. And they're all great, but there's nowhere better than here. But if we want to do, and Larry passed around a booklet, leaflet in relation to Victor Hugo just before, which said this. There's a quote that I thought that struck me. There's nothing like a dream to create the future. Well, my dream is that Guernsey will be a better place in 10 years than it is now, and it'll be a better place in 20 years than it was in 10 years' time. But it's not going to be either of those unless we make some dramatic decisions. And of course, the present population, the present states members, are no different from states members of days gone by in relation to where we are. There was something in the Guernsey press today, which I call the Gavin St Pierre press, but that's a different matter. We won't go in relation to that. There was something in the Guernsey press today about 1978. And Consigliere Eric Bodman was saying, look, we've got to bring in earnings-related social insurance contributions, because we've had a flat contribution since the old age pension was set up in 1952, and that's not going to work. Now, that took 26 years, or thereabouts, to achieve. And where would we be now if we didn't have earnings-related social insurance contributions? But states members after states members didn't want it, and the public of Guernsey didn't want it. The public of Guernsey also didn't want the leisure centre, and that takes me to the event that we've just had in last week, where Guernsey was at its best. Nowhere could have done it better than us. We had the Island Games for 6 or 7 days last week. It was undoubtedly the best Island Games ever. It even topped our 2003 efforts. But one of the focal points was a boat ashore for the swimming and various other sports. A states member by the name of Tony Brown in the 1970s wanted to build the leisure centre. He lost his seat at the next election because the public said, we don't want a leisure centre, we don't want to spend that money. That's terrible. What will we do without that now? So we've got to sometimes make difficult decisions. And there are difficult decisions to be made. Now, I think just in relation to, I'll go backwards that way. And there's a picture of me with, there's Mark Degari. I think that's a head of public service. And more importantly, there's Christina Moore. Now, we've got to be working clearly more proactively with Jersey than we have in the history of wherever we've done it. Now, also Victor Hugo said, and I can't resist this comment, it said about Victor Hugo that he was our most famous ever resident. Well, there's a couple of states members in Guernsey who would probably dispute that because of their own self-esteem, but he probably was a little bit more famous than they are. Just go back again. Now, you've asked 3 questions. Just before we come to those questions, there are big issues, and the point of my rather verbose introduction was they're urgent issues, because the longer we take to address them, the harder they become to solve and the more serious consequences there are for the lives of islanders. Now, we in due course, at the end of September, late September, there's going to be a new funding initiative programme. The capital reprioritisation will be looked at again. Now, states members are going to have to stand up and be brave. They weren't brave in February and March. They thought, January and February, they thought there was an easy solution. And we were a bit like Mike Tyson. We were knocked out in the 3rd round, really, as he was against when he fought Lennox Lewis. But in connection with all of that, we are in a position whereby we can't put off tomorrow. We've got to make decisions today, because Stephen talked about the lack of capital investment over the last 10 or 15 years or whatever. He's absolutely right. So we've got to try and solve some of the problems of the unsustainability, because that's what it is, of our public finances. And our capital has been underinvested, as I've just said. So let's look at those 3 questions. The 3 questions posed by Chamber are as follows, paraphrasing them. Can we justify the delay in our capital investment? Where do we stand on the balance between savings and productivity on the one hand and revenue raising on the other? And what's the timeline to bring those back to the states? So if we move on, I keep going the wrong way, but there we go. We move on to our next slide. If we look at the spending on capital, we've underinvested in capital, in other words, in our public infrastructure for a decade. Now, we've already got a capital programme that we've promised to deliver over the next 3 or 4 years, but frankly, looking at the finances now, we've not got a snowball's chance of delivering in the next 3 or 4 years. But it's even worse than that, because almost weekly, but certainly monthly, we get very beneficial, very meritorious, because everything on the capital investment plan is meritorious, request to us saying, you should invest in this, or we need money for that, or something comes out the clear blue sky which shows that we need to invest in it. Now, we haven't got the money to do that going forward. And what this shows is that over a period of time, we've invested about an average of 1.3% of GDP in capital. Now, that should be closer to 2%. Oh, that doesn't sound a lot. What, 0.7%? What's that? But that actually means an average of £25 million every year. And the only year we've actually achieved our goal was 2012, when we were invested in the airport runway, and perhaps we should have extended it at that time, but that's a different topic. And also we were doing a school. Other than that, we've underinvested every single time. So does it sound hypocritical of me to say that while considering delaying some of the capital projects, maybe the second phase of hospital modernisation, maybe the school, is that hypocritical when I'm saying we've underinvested? On the face of it, yes, but in reality, no. Does delaying projects also mean that it'll cost more because of inflation? Absolutely. Inflation's not going to go away. Hopefully it won't be as high as it's been over the last 12 months or so, but it's going to be around. So that's a valid point. But as your mum probably told you, certainly my mum told me, because she was financially prudent, my father wasn't quite in the same camp, you can only build what you can afford. You can only spend the money that you realistically can achieve, either by borrowing, by revenue, or by other purposes. I'm not quite sure what the other purposes is. So when we come to the affordability of capital projects, we're simply not generating significant surplus to support the spend. I'll come back to that too, but I'll just make this comment here, and Stephen touched upon it again. This year, we've actually had a revenue deficit of about £3 million or so. That's very unusual, and hopefully won't be repeated this year. We've been generally supported by our good investment returns, and hopefully, in the passage of time, that will come. But the less investment you've got, the less reserves you've got, the less returns you can get on them. And if we spend our reserves, which aren't that substantial anyway, we'll have less investment returns. We'll have less money to spend. We'll have less to invest in capital projects. Now, sorry, I'm going the other way again. I'll get it right. Now, we look at these particular figures, you could see where we are in connection to revenue surplus versus capital spend. Our deficit I've referred to, and we need to invest in capital ongoing between 1.5 and 2%. We need to invest in 2%. Now, one of the very clever amendments brought by some of my colleagues, which found great favour with states members, is we'll solve our problem by underinvesting in capital by reducing the GDP amount that we've got to invest in capital. We'll reduce it from 2% to 1.5%. Well, you may believe in Reprioritisation economics. I don't. That was just a fudge because those people obviously they're looking at election in 2 years' time, and they don't understand basic economics, which you, as commercial people, I think, do understand. So, where can we do? You probably think the States has got vast reserves, and substantial reserves. Well, it doesn't really. I'll go back again. I'll go the wrong way. It doesn't. Because if you look at the funding that capital reserves, you can see by early 2027, if we continue along the way that we are, we'll have no capital reserves of any consequence left. Now, 2027 may seem a long time away, but it's only 3.5 years or thereabouts. And in a government and in a business, that is not a period of time that you can say is going to give you sufficient time to be able to turn things around dramatically. So committing to spend all our reserves now, in my view, would be reckless. We'd be simply leaving a worse problem for our successors. I don't want to be part of that. We have a duty not just to our community now, but to the people in the future. And the future is 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, and beyond. Now, we've spent very little, as I say, on capital projects over the last 10, 15 years, and we're paying for that now. And we really are at a crisis point. So we then come to what was agreed in the tax review debate. Now, most of you will have followed the tax review debate, and you'll appreciate the ambition was to provide a plan for sustainable public services. We wanted to ensure that we could fund public services going forward, and that includes being able to invest in the essential infrastructure. We failed, and we failed miserably. Again, a point Stephen touched upon, the states were going to come back, we're going to come back with a funding proposal, and here we are, we're now, July of 2023. This state has been in office since October 2020, 2 years, 9 months. We've achieved nothing in that regard. And I'm not so sure, but I hope I'm wrong, that we'll achieve much at the end of September. But I look for wisdom from my colleagues in the States and from people like yourselves and from our wider community as to how we can address that. That failure weighed heavily upon me. I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I think in relation to my States career, which goes back to 94 to 2000 and beyond, that was the most depressed I felt. I felt that we all 40 of us in the States, abrogated our responsibility. We were inept. We didn't come up with something that was meaningful. We didn't come up with anything that we could persuade the public that I thought and others thought was going to be agreed. We had no simple, comprehensive plan that was agreed in that debate. Of course, there were some constructive work streams that were agreed, and we're taking those forward. One of them, which I know chimes with Chamber's views, is to look what can be done to improve participation. And again, Stephen has spoken of that. On the cost side, obviously, we're reviewing the capital portfolio. And also, we set up 2 subcommittees. One of those was to look at reducing the costs. And we've had over 1,800 suggestions from the business community, from the public, as to those. Some of those are good ideas, some are not so good, but they are all welcome, and we're grateful to people for engaging. It was like the engagement that we had at the Island Games just last week. Now, we're also acting to reduce cost while that work continues. We've set a target of no real terms growth overall in the general revenue expenditure in 2024, which means that all committees other than health are looking to fund and find nominal savings of 2.5% for next year. Whether that's achieved or not, we'll wait and see. Because most committees say, it's a jolly good idea, but we can't do that because we've got to spend money on this, that, or the other. So the discipline will be whether people can do that over the next 12 months. Now, the growing cost, again, it's not magic. It's happening in Jersey. It's happening in most places in the world. It's our ageing population. We've got a growing population of people that are living older, and we've got a relatively smaller working population. Stephen touched upon the people 40 years plus who don't work anymore for a variety of reasons. So we've also got another committee, of course, subcommittee, which is chaired by our Treasury Lead Deputy, Mark Hellier, which is look at revenue-raising options. And that's not limited to revenues from corporates. But just if anybody thinks, because what happened until 2007, 2008, other people from outside of Guernsey were paying our income tax. They were paying our contributions because we had a tax system which allowed us to do so. That was stopped by outside forces over which we've got no control. So all of a sudden we had to pay our own income tax, and we had to tax people more than they were previously taxed. But our tax as a percentage of GDP is about 21%. In Jersey, it's 26%. In France, it's over 40%. I was talking to the Prime Minister of the Faroes, who was over for the Island Games just last week. At £50,000 a year, you're paying 50% income tax in the Faroes, together with all the other taxes. Now, I'd be the last person in the world to say that we should approach that. But if we look at our workforce non-participation, there are lots of people who are not participating financially. They're making other contributions, if I could just mention that, because it's not a criticism of people. We all live our own lives. Now, what I'm going to do in a moment is ask you to raise your hands, but I'll ask you to raise your hands when I've said this. We estimate that there's somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people of working age who are not currently employed. We think that about 1,000, perhaps 1,300 or 1,400 of those can't work because they're in poor health or they've got care responsibilities. 600 appear to be non-working parents, we understand that, and about 300 are employed or unemployed or between jobs. That still leaves probably over 3,000 people for whom there's no obvious reason that they're not working. They're predominantly over 50, and there are more females than males. They generally own their own home and have worked in sectors that provide them with good pensions. Some will have inherited wealth. They can afford not to work. That's not to say, as I said, those people do nothing. They do parental responsibilities, they look after their grandchildren, they work and participate in the third sector. Now, we've got to encourage more people to work because the statistics are considerable and they're considerably adverse to where we otherwise would be. Now, we've taken some steps. Pension increases are such, or age increases in relation to pension, that by 2049, you're going to have to be 70 before you get a full state pension. The public sector pension arrangements were amended 8 years ago to align with the state pension age, so early retirement from the public sector should reduce. The states agreed a direction to pursue higher levels of net migration, and if that can be achieved, but that's a very big if, it would help balance, it would never completely balance the effect of the ageing population. Now, there are currently 2 states' resolutions to look further at this subject, one from the tax debate and one from the population debate. Analysis is being done on those options for improving participation, some of which will be under discussion for the 2024 budget. But since the largest group of are people who can afford not to work, persuading them to come back to work with all of the troubles and stresses that we have at work, and dissuading new early retirees from leaving is going to be difficult. If you consider that any incentives might be needed to offer to the 12,000 over 50s who are still working to persuade even a small proportion of the non-employed back into the workforce, it's very expensive. So the question I'm going to ask you is, can you raise your hands? There are some beyond that age anyway, like Robert Sillars and myself, but there are others probably aren't. Who here is going to be retiring other than through age in the next five years or so? Good. Therefore, we've got commercial people who are going to continue to work going forward. I mean, that's encouraging, but if you've got friends, it's a bit like Lord Kitchener, really. We know he had ended up getting drowned, but your island needs you, and you need to speak to people in your island to encourage them to make more of a financial contribution if they particularly can. Now, spending. On the spending front, I've already mentioned before the restrictions for committees in the next budget. And we've got a subcommittee tasked with finding a recurring 10 to 16 million pounds of cost reductions. But that shouldn't underestimate how challenging that will be, or what potentially important services could change or be reduced to achieve it. Look at what Deputy Brewer tried to do and the castigation he got when he tried to make some adjustments to the health funding. Look at what Deputy Dudley Owen's getting now about the Sports Commission and trying to reduce spending in relation to that by a mere 100 to 200,000 pounds. All of those comments made by members of the public are valid ones, but everything you try and do, there's always a pressure group saying you can't do that, there should be a special case. All the special cases add up to no cuts. And I've got to say, although I very much respect my colleagues in the States of Guernsey, I wouldn't, if there was an Island Games gold medal for courage and political courage, I don't think Guernsey would win it. So in relation to where we are, we have to look at where we're going to be. Now, you can see what we spend compared with Jersey, the Isle of Man and the UK, and our spending is actually, 12.2 that column, 13.5 this column, and we are in the position that we are in relation to that. So also, if we go to the next slide, we talked about spending cuts, and our public sector is nowhere near as fat as you think. If you compare the 21 accounts of Guernsey to the UK, Jersey and the Isle of Man, we actually spend a lot less per head of population than any of them. If we were spending at the same rate per capita as Jersey, we'd need every year an additional 52 million. Or if we were spending at the same rate as our colleagues in the Isle of Man, we'd be spending an extra 84 million pounds a year. Now, of course, there's differences in exactly what publicly funded services are available in various jurisdictions, but I think just to give that as a broad and somewhat crude example and comparison is helpful. So we don't have lots and lots of assets that we could sell. Mind you, I get criticised because I go off at tangents sometimes in relation to my thinking, but it's the way, it's little things that can add up to big things. The States has a bit of land it could sell. Cat Hill Hospital, probably Lucas House, one or two other sites. It wouldn't bring in hundreds of millions, but it would bring in millions. And then just last week, our Development and Planning Authority have decided to list the Cat Hill Hospital, which effectively means nobody's ever going to buy it. You can't knock it down, you'll never be able to develop it. So there's an asset that some politicians believe is so important to be maintained in its squalor and its decay that it's not going to be an asset that's going to be able to be used by the public of Guernsey when we try to fight our going forward. So what comes next? Now, if we look at where we also administer services, and I should just go in relation to that, to where we were with the last slide. Our old age pension, or the Guernsey pension it is now called, because Guernsey, like everywhere, is becoming more and more wokish. You can't call a man, a woman, a woman. You can't say somebody's old. You can't say they suffer from something, because if you are, you're going to get criticised by somebody. Well, I'm too old to care about that. But in relation to that, the old age pension is administered in Guernsey by 2 civil servants. 2 civil servants. So it couldn't be any leaner or slicker than we are in relation to that. So there are no easy answers. We need to also be realistic about how much money we can take out of people's pockets. One of the people I met, and that's a great advantage of when you go to something like the Island Games, or you meet politicians from other jurisdictions. I met the education minister from the Isle of Man, and that was at the reception on the Saturday afternoon. And she spent part of the morning going around our estate agents and taking pictures. Now, the Isle of Man has got, despite its massive land area compared with us, and its relatively small population compared with us, 85,000 against our 64,000, they've got a housing problem. The average price of a house in the Isle of Man is £350,000. The average price of a house in Guernsey is £680,000. She couldn't believe how expensive it was to rent or purchase a local market property. Now, if we say, oh, well, we're going to put more income tax on the ordinary person earning 40, 50, 60, 70,000 pounds a year, how are they going to afford to live? How are those people going to pay their bills? Because 60 or 70,000 pounds a year is well above the average wage. The average wage is what, 38 to 40,000 pounds a year. You're certainly no prince beyond the dreams of wealth beyond the dreams of princes in relation to that. You're struggling to provide yourself with a home and to provide your family with a decent living. So there are no easy answers, but it would be helpful if some answers were delivered by my colleagues in relation to where we are. Now, this is what comes next. We've got the government work plan that's going to be debated tomorrow. We've got the capital funding and capital portfolio and funding and investment plan that'll be debated late September, and we've got the budget later in the year. But there are always pluses in Guernsey, and Guernsey has always come through. Think about the occupation, and John Le Toc tells a story, but of course it was different than those because people didn't have the welfare benefits that they've got now. Just after Napoleonic times, Guernsey was in a desperate financial position. It owed the equivalent of billions of pounds in those days. So what did it do? In 1820 to 1830, it created the market. In 1850, it created the harbours. It looked forward. It was proactive. And what the states just did, albeit in a watered-down form, at least they overwhelmingly supported the formation of the Guernsey Development Agency in the last states meeting. Now, that focuses on our east coast, not just from an economic point of view, because man and woman is more than just money, but also from environmental health, accessibility, and also critical infrastructure. All of that, those people will help. So in the same way as we've underinvested in our capital, we've struggled to do anything on the East Coast. I grew up in Shirotri. I used to walk to the market because it was different in those days with my mum, and Mill Street was bustling. For the last 20, 30 years, Mill Street is not something you've really wanted to walk through. So it needs regeneration. It needs regeneration. If it needs regeneration, it needs people to be encouraged as to where we're going to be. Now, in August, we'll publish our final proposed capital portfolio. That will be a mix of the projects that we think we might be able to prioritise, and we'll also be publishing the funding and investment plan. As I said, those will be debated in September. Now, those plans need to work together, because capital spending needs a sustainable financial plan. If we can agree measures that will allow us to invest more in our capital, we may be able to delay fewer of the big essential projects. I don't want to be deciding whether we can delay a hospital or a school, or we can do neither. But it's going to be very difficult unless the states make the radical decisions to do very much in September. But that will be a matter for the states, because after all, go back to one of the earlier slides, if we carry on as we are, we will have no money left in 3 years' time, 3.5 years' time. And what S&P, we were downgraded, if you remember, a few months ago. We're now one notch level than Jersey and the Isle of Man. Although theoretically we could be downgraded further, it shouldn't affect too much our borrowing, the rates that we could borrow at. Look how that would look to the public at large, to those who want to invest, whether they're going to set up Guernsey, the Isle of Man or Jersey. We'd then be 2 notches below them. Now, it'll take at least 3 years of considered, balanced and sensible judgment for us to be able to go back and say, can we have the previous grading? So we've got to make decisions, otherwise things will get worse and not better. So we have to say, and I have to say to you, as sensible people, Chamber of Commerce, that word is the the governing, your last of those three words is the governing thing. There aren't any easy answers. Now, I believed in Father Christmas till I was about 43, but I don't believe him anymore now. He doesn't exist. We have got to make difficult decisions. So if I go, what I think will be the last stage, we've got to go to Development Agency, and we got the crowds cheering in Market Square and various. Well, that's the Island Games last week, but also the crowds were cheering in Market Square. Deputies were singing Sweet Caroline to people, and the deputies didn't discharge their duties. They acted in a populist way. I don't really mind. I can only take the horse to water. I can't force the horse to drink. So it'll be a matter for the states. It'll be a very, very important meeting in late September as to where the states is going to go going forward. So I began my term as President of Policy and Resources Chief Minister by leading the second phase of the COVID pandemic. We were 8 months into it by the time that we had Deputy Secretary was stepped down from his role as Chief Minister and I took over. We had another 16 months going forward. We had the second lockdown in January, February of 2021, which lasted less time than the first one because by that time we had the vaccine, and then we had to come out of it. Now that we bounced back much quicker than we thought, but we've still got a long, long way to go. So while there are many winners in our environment and our economy, we've also got some losers, and we've really got to come out as a true winner. So I'd like to just conclude in the way that I started by just saying, let's join together. As the island joined together, the 64,000 people that make up the residents of Guernsey, let's join together, that togetherness, and seize the moment to make sure that we can sustain what we've got now, that we can improve it, and that we can make this magnificent island secure and sustainable for the future. I believe we can, but it's going to need everybody in this room and a lot more people outside if we're going to do that. Thank you very much.
My name is Hayley North. Thank you for that. I agree that it's a case of Guernsey needs us at this point in time, and I agree that we've got to make difficult decisions. Where we disagree strongly is what those decisions need to be, so what the solutions are. So in terms of states pension and universal health care and long-term care provision for everybody, those things to a large degree were set in place to protect the most vulnerable in society. Yet many of us are going to benefit from those things who are not the most vulnerable, and we don't need that support. That is a huge element of the structural deficit going forward, and resolving those things and changing those policies, which involves all of us stepping up and taking a hit in one way or another, is a structural way to resolve a structural deficit. GST is not structural. It is a quick fix, a sticking plaster, which is going to have to constantly be increased over time, and also targets those who are spending money, which is not always necessarily the people who are at the moment benefiting most from those things and don't need that support.
Okay. Well,
I'll turn that into a question. I'll turn that into a question for you there, Peter. So the question, I suspect, here is what would you do rather than introducing GST to cut in policy terms with regards to help for those that don't necessarily need it? So we're looking at...
Yeah, I think it's fair. I understand the question. I think the sentiment also wasn't quite said. It was almost we should be means testing, which I don't agree with. We should be means testing some of the universal benefits that people get. I mean, I think we should do some of that in relation to, I'm over a certain age, I don't pay for my prescriptions. I think that's ridiculous. I think I should pay for my prescriptions, and I think there are other things you could do in that regard. But that's not going to make any inroads of any kind in relation to where we are. Now, I've been waiting. You say no GST. Remember, it wasn't just GST. That was the headline thing. That was the Sweet Caroline in Market Square type thing. It was actually reducing income tax to 15% on the first £30,000 of your taxable income. And it would have actually benefited 60% of our community and made the other 40% pay more. Now, there are lots of things we could do, but none of them are substantial enough to plug the gap. Now, You know what the gap is. You've seen the figures. They're all publicly available, as they should be. The state should be transparent. Now, there was talk about, Stephen, I think, mentioned it, somebody else mentioned it, about accounting standards. For 10 years, it was known that the IPSAS accounting standards were not being followed and nothing was done. So we've brought that in gradually. But as somebody who spent nearly all his professional life as a lawyer cross-examining experts of all disciplines, the ones that I found the most fun with were cross-examining accountants, because they could hardly ever make the sums tally when you went through any detailed cross-examination. That's no disrespect to them, but that was the reality of where we are. So I went back to my mum. It sounds like Miss Marple, you know, from St Mary's Mead, where she learned how to catch all these murderers by looking at what the local postmistress did, etc., etc. Forget accounting standards. They must be proper and professional, etc., etc. So I'm not dismissive of them. But you can only spend what you've got, or you can borrow. And you can only borrow if you can afford to pay back. Otherwise, your credit rating will be affected, and in the event, you can't pay back what you haven't got the income to do. So it's a long time, and it's a short time between now and the 26th, 27th of September. Come up with, that's a very good question, a very good statement, I understand that point of view, come up with a fully costed proposal as to how states' finances can do the kind of things it should do and what it should do going forward.
Hi, I'm Neil McDermott. Has the government ever thought of a public-private partnership so that you can actually use other people's money to build something, and then in the long term, the government, well, short term, you benefit, the people benefit from it, but long term, you've got a benefit. I'll give you a perfect example. The Severn Bridge going across from England to Wales. It's built by a French company. I think they did a 20-year lease on it. They collected the money for 20 years and then handed it back to Wales. It could never have been built unless it was by private money. The power stations, the nuclear power stations that's been built by the Chinese in the UK, it's not costing the taxpayer a penny. The deal is that they can sell so much per therm for so many years, and then that nuclear power plant becomes the UK's.
Yeah, we have thought of it, and it will continue under thought, but it's not just as easy as, I'd appreciate your asking a question. There are some success stories. There are also lots and lots of failures in relation to public-private investment in the UK, where the only people that seem to have benefited would be the private investors rather than the state, because the state has generally been outgunned in relation to negotiations in connection with such matters. And that's the same here too. So, yes, it's something to look at, but to think, oh, well, we can start all our projects, we can solve all our projects by a private-public cooperation agreement, etc. Because, for example, how would we fund the hospital by doing that? How would we fund the schools by doing that? Because there would be no economic return to a private investor in relation to those. You would, say, with a pool marina, you would with the bridge, you would with other things where you can charge people, I know, £10, £50, etc., where you've got a revenue stream. But I can't see how it would work when you don't have a revenue stream.
Thank you. Peter, can I just unpick what you said very briefly there in terms of you're not in favour of means testing? Can you just perhaps explain what you mean by that in specific terms?
It's a general statement. I'm not in favour of saying, I mean, for example, people pay into the social insurance fund to get an old age pension. And when they're 65 and 8 months now, or it'll be 66 or whatever age is, they should get that pension because they've contributed. They've paid into that, they should get whatever that is. So that's what I mean by means testing. There are certain things where you could have means testing. I've just given another trivial example of your prescriptions. There's no need for people like me and probably anybody else in this room when they get to that age to have their prescriptions paid for by the state. That's not going to bridge our gap, but it's something. So there could be certain things that could be means tested, but I'm not in favour of general means testing.
Thank you, Steve. I saw one of the bullet points coming out of the February debate was a review of public sector terms of benefits, including pensions. As a stakeholder in resolving these issues, how amenable are the public sector unions to helping you find a solution?
Well, in fact, we've been discussing that since then, and it came across the table of P&R today as a further development in relation to what we're going to do there. Well, I mean, unions are there to represent their members. They're not going to want anything, any lessening of benefits for their members. You can understand that. And, that doesn't make them bad people. But ultimately, it's a decision that we're going to have to take. And we can take the decision, but it's got to be in a proper and balanced way to say new people joining the States of Guernsey, their pension arrangements are such and such, because you're a new employee. It's different to changing, as we all know, as employers and employees, changing existing arrangements. So it certainly is being addressed, and it is an important topic.
Deputy Ferbrache, I'd just like to understand what proposals are there so far to encourage the over 40s and the people who aren't working back into work. What proposals are there so far?
Well, I think in relation to, I think that's an excellent point, but a lot of it is persuasion. We can't give people benefits in the sense we haven't got the money to give people large chunks of benefits. We've talked about the state's finances, but it's persuading people. Because people, a lot of people will be employed in the private sector, more people are employed in the private sector than the public sector. So it's making sure that arrangements can be made with people, Chamber of Commerce that are employers, that are reasonably favourable to employees. I mean, people work from home more now. There's more flexible working, all of which is a good thing. Because in the old days, you had to be in the office from 8 till 5, and that was it. There was no scope for that. And if you couldn't work 5 days a week, 48 weeks a year, well, you weren't wanted. Well, that's not the way the workforce is. I'd rather have something for 20 weeks a year, 3 days a week, than not at all. So it's really a matter of persuasion. But for the government to come out with large tracts of fiscal benefits for that is unrealistic.
Just a couple of quick points, really. Going back to the first talk, I wonder if artificially intelligent robot deputies would be better and braver. But a lot of the wise words Deputy Ferbrache has said today are not widely known among some deputies and in society. The case, in a way, still has to be made. So my question is, how can we improve data communication of the real issues? We heard from Stephen about people saying, oh, we haven't got a deficit, or we can do it all by cuts, which are quite frankly wrong, unless you really went down a radical route. So how can we improve the communication of the real position and our competition with other places? And then that brings on, isn't a cheap way out of this problem to borrow more bonds for the next 2 years until we have an election which changes the political landscape of some kind?
Well, let me deal with that second point first, John, because we can only borrow money if we can afford to pay it back. Because I think the credit agencies would be happier if we had a higher percentage of borrowing, but we don't have the income to sustain it. And nobody's going to borrow for you're not going to borrow just willy-nilly. You've got to be on a considered, if it's public borrowing anyway, it's got to be on a considered basis. But certainly that is an option that needs to be looked at for the foreseeable future, but not as a short-term fix. And who knows who will be elected in June 25, sorry. Probably you, John. You'll be one of the state's members for return. But as to communication, of course, John's absolutely right. The more communication, the more that you can tell people what the facts are, then there's the more opportunity for people to appreciate it. I'm not a communications expert, but John makes a good point.
Thank you very much. Unless there's any other questions, I'm going to draw it to a close there and just ask you all to thank Deputy Ferbrache again in the usual way. Thank you.